They cheer the speeches and remember the gestures. That is what photographs preserve. What cameras rarely captured were the quieter transactions. Exchange rate adjustments buried in official gazettes. Municipal orders redefining citizenship. Property records that turned family homes into administrative vacancies. One decree made a nation appear economically formidable. Another decree made entire communities disappear from legal recognition. The machinery of harm operated most effectively when it resembled bureaucracy, stamped, filed, and legally defensible. It felt procedural, so resistance felt irrational. This examination traces that administrative apparatus, the system through which cruelty presented itself as governance, and left actual human lives absorbing consequences that were never accounted for in the official records. Historical memory preserves certain images with remarkable consistency: the theatrical posturing, the architectural grandiosity, the eventual military collapse. These elements create a contained narrative, one that suggests the danger was always visible, always performative. What that narrative omits is the infrastructure that operated beneath public spectacle, the administrative systems that normalized exclusion, the economic policies that reframed deprivation as national contribution, the legal frameworks that made displacement look like urban planning. None of this required dramatic announcement. It required forms compliance and the gradual adjustment of what felt acceptable. This investigation examines that deeper structure, the mechanisms through which authoritarianism embedded itself, not through force alone, but through the reorganization of daily life into patterns that made resistance seem impractical and collaboration seem inevitable. For most Americans who encountered this history through education or popular media, Benito Mussolini occupies a clearly defined role in the narrative of the Second World War. He appears as the bombastic Italian dictator, the fascist leader who aligned with Hitler, delivered grandiose speeches from Roman balconies, pursued ill-conceived military campaigns in Africa and Greece, and ultimately met a violent end when his regime collapsed. In this widely held understanding, Mussolini represents theatrical authoritarianism, a leader whose ambitions exceeded his capabilities, and whose legacy is primarily one of failure and humiliation. That characterization contains factual elements. Mussolini's military ventures did end disastrously. His alliance with Nazi Germany did prove catastrophic for Italy. His execution by partisans in 1945 did represent a dramatic conclusion to his rule. These are documented historical realities, and recognizing them is not incorrect. What this common narrative tends to minimize, however, is the infrastructure that preceded those dramatic failures. The most consequential damage inflicted by Mussolini's regime did not emerge from battlefield defeats or rhetorical excess. It developed earlier, through quieter mechanisms, during the years when fascism was consolidating power through administrative reorganization rather than military conquest. Long before Italy's catastrophic entry into global war, the regime had established methods for governing that made exclusion feel procedural, surveillance feel protective, and suffering feel like civic contribution. The genuine threat was never limited to what was shouted from balconies. It resided in what was codified, implemented, and gradually accepted as the new terms of ordinary life. Authority rarely announces itself through sudden rupture. It establishes itself through incremental adjustment, reshaping the patterns of daily existence before it attempts to alter fundamental beliefs. The transformation occurs gradually enough that most people fail to identify a specific moment when compliance shifted from conscious choice to automatic behavior. The environment continues to appear familiar. Transportation systems function. Administrative offices maintain regular hours. Official communications retain measured professional language. This was precisely where Mussolini's fascist apparatus demonstrated its greatest effectiveness. Not during moments of visible crisis, but during periods that felt like the restoration of order and stability. Fascism in Italy did not begin by disrupting the rhythms of ordinary life. Instead, it systematically reorganized those rhythms. State authority inserted itself into schedules, institutions, and social expectations with such procedural regularity that obedience ceased to register as a political position. It became indistinguishable from practical necessity. The mechanics of this transformation are worth examining in specific detail. Under Mussolini's direction, the Italian state extended its reach into domains that had previously operated with relative autonomy. Independent trade unions, which had represented workers' interests and provided organizational infrastructure for labor movements, were formally dissolved and replaced with state-controlled syndicates that answered directly to the regime. These new structures maintained the appearance of worker representation, while eliminating the actual capacity for independent advocacy. Local government officials who had been elected or appointed through established civic processes were systematically removed and replaced with party loyalists. Their primary qualification was political alignment, rather than administrative competence or community connection. Civic organizations, professional associations, and cultural institutions underwent similar transformations. They were not eliminated outright, which would have generated visible resistance and created obvious vacancies in community life. Instead, they were gradually absorbed into the regime's organizational framework, becoming extensions of state authority while maintaining their original names and ostensible functions. This approach proved remarkably effective. By the time opposition groups fully recognized the extent of institutional capture, the mechanisms that might have facilitated organized resistance had already been dismantled. Independent meeting spaces, autonomous communication networks, established leadership structures, all gone through entirely legal procedures, documented in official records, and implemented with broad public acquiescence or passive acceptance. Economic decisions are routinely presented to the public as technical matters requiring specialized expertise, rather than political choices reflecting particular values and priorities. Statistical indicators appear neutral and objective. Policy adjustments are framed as temporary measures responding to external circumstances. Sacrifice can always be justified and even valorized when it is presented as necessary for collective survival or national advancement. Mussolini possessed an intuitive understanding of this dynamic and exploited it with considerable skill. Economic policy became a carefully staged performance through which national prestige was demonstrated and collective identity was reinforced. Strength was measured through symbolic indicators rather than through material improvements in the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Economic suffering was not denied or hidden from view. Instead, it was systematically reframed as patriotic contribution, as evidence that Italians were making the sacrifices necessary for national greatness. One of the regime's most celebrated economic initiatives provides clear illustration of this pattern. In 1927, Mussolini dramatically revalued the Italian lira, a move known as Quota 90 because it pegged the currency at 90 lira to the British pound. This decision was presented as a bold assertion of Italian economic strength and international status. The regime promoted it as evidence that Italy now stood as an equal to the major European powers, that Italian currency carried weight in global markets, that the nation had transcended its historical position of economic subordination. The actual economic consequences revealed a different reality. The artificially strengthened currency made Italian exports significantly more expensive in foreign markets, undermining the competitiveness of Italian manufacturers and agricultural producers who depended on international trade. Domestic industries faced increased pressure. Agricultural communities, particularly in southern Italy, absorbed severe economic strain as their products became unaffordable to foreign buyers. Wages declined in real terms, even as the cost of imported goods rose. Working families experienced tangible deterioration in their standard of living. Yet the official narrative never acknowledged these consequences as policy failures. Economic hardship was continuously reframed as evidence of national sacrifice, proof that Italians possessed the discipline and fortitude required for greatness. By the time the damage became impossible to ignore, the regime had successfully established an environment where economic critique could be equated with political disloyalty, where questioning policy outcomes could be characterized as undermining national unity. The economic pain was not an unfortunate side effect of otherwise sound policy. It was politically useful, a mechanism for testing and reinforcing compliance, while demonstrating the regime's willingness to prioritize symbolic strength over material welfare. When a government claims to be improving society, opposition becomes substantially more difficult to articulate or justify. Improvement sounds inherently benevolent and progressive. Rational planning suggests scientific precision and expertise. Intentional design implies humanistic concern for welfare and flourishing. Mussolini's regime did not merely govern the Italian population. It explicitly sought to engineer a new society. Landscapes underwent deliberate redesign. Population distributions were systematically reorganized. Entire communities were relocated under policy frameworks that invoked efficiency, public health, and modernization. When examined through official documentation and propaganda materials, these initiatives appeared genuinely progressive for their era. New towns materialized in previously undeveloped regions. Infrastructure expanded into areas that had lacked basic services. Photographs and newsreels displayed geometric order and contemporary architecture, where informal settlements and agricultural communities had previously existed. These transformations, however, came with conditions that were less visible in the official presentations. Families were relocated without meaningful consultation or consent. The social networks and community relationships that had provided mutual support and cultural continuity were severed. Surveillance systems followed resettlement, monitoring the relocated populations for signs of dissent or insufficient enthusiasm. Access to housing, employment, and basic services became contingent on demonstrated loyalty to the regime. These projects were never solely about land use or housing provision. They functioned as instruments for producing a particular type of citizen, one whose existence aligned with and validated the regime's vision of proper Italian identity and social organization. The violence embedded in these processes was not spectacular or photogenic. It was structural and administrative. It operated through the denial of choice, the severing of connections, the imposition of dependency, and the continuous assessment of political reliability as a condition for basic security. Official documents framed all of this as benevolent intervention, as the state fulfilling its responsibility to guide the population toward better conditions and higher purposes. Geographic distance fundamentally alters what a state permits itself to do. So does the presence of racial hierarchy and the absence of domestic scrutiny. In Italy's African colonies, particularly in Libya and later in Ethiopia, Mussolini's government operated with constraints that were dramatically reduced compared to those that still functioned, however weakly, within metropolitan Italy. These territories became experimental spaces where policies could be implemented with greater speed, severity, and permanence. With limited concern for consequences or accountability, the administrative language remained consistent with that used domestically. The actual methods became far more absolute. Large-scale population displacement was executed as official policy. Libyan communities were forcibly removed from agricultural lands to facilitate Italian colonial settlement. Concentration camps were established and filled with civilians under the administrative designation of security measures. These camps, operated under Italian military authority, confined tens of thousands of people in conditions that resulted in catastrophic mortality rates. Movement outside designated areas was prohibited and enforced through severe penalties. Access to food, water, and shelter became conditional and controlled. Survival itself was rendered uncertain and dependent on administrative decisions made by colonial officials who faced no effective oversight. In Ethiopia, Following the Italian invasion in 1935, the regime employed poison gas against civilian populations and military forces, despite international prohibitions. Bombing campaigns deliberately targeted medical facilities marked with Red Cross symbols. Reprisal killings were conducted systematically in response to resistance activities, with entire villages destroyed and populations executed. These were not isolated excesses by individual commanders operating beyond their authority. They reflected policy decisions made in Rome and communicated through official military channels. The bureaucratic apparatus did not collapse under the weight of these actions. It adapted to accommodate them. Orders were issued, documented, and filed. Reports were compiled and submitted through established chains of command. Photographs were taken for administrative records, the same procedural systems that managed municipal governance in Italian cities, managed mass detention and systematic killing in African territories. What had remained largely implicit within Italy, the willingness to treat human life as administratively disposable, became explicit and operational in the colonies. The distance provided cover. The racial hierarchy provided justification. The bureaucracy provided method. At no point did this system require universal ideological conviction or genuine belief from all participants. It required only participation, the performance of assigned roles within established procedures. Propaganda efforts did not need to convince every Italian citizen that fascism was philosophically correct or morally superior. The objective was normalization, the gradual process through which extraordinary measures began to register as ordinary conditions. Successes were amplified and circulated widely through controlled media. Failures were obscured, minimized, or reframed as temporary setbacks on the path to inevitable triumph. Responsibility for harmful outcomes was dispersed across multiple institutions and administrative levels, making it difficult to trace any specific consequence back to any identifiable decision or individual decision maker. Most people engaged with this system did not experience themselves as cruel or complicit in atrocity. They experienced themselves as employed, as useful, as fulfilling professional responsibilities within legitimate institutions. The bureaucrat processing relocation orders was completing paperwork according to established procedures. The railway administrator coordinating transportation was managing logistics. The municipal official updating citizenship records was maintaining accurate documentation. Each individual action, viewed in isolation, could appear routine, even mundane. This fragmentation of agency and dispersal of visibility is precisely why the system endured as long as it did and functioned as effectively as it did. Harm did not consistently register as harm when it arrived in the language of administrative necessity and procedural correctness. The structures that enabled exclusion, surveillance, displacement, and ultimately mass violence were embedded within frameworks that appeared legitimate, that operated through recognized channels, that maintained the surface characteristics of normal governance. By the time consequences became impossible to ignore or reframe, when military defeat exposed the regime's failures, when Allied forces revealed the full scope of atrocities committed in occupied territories, when the apparatus of control finally collapsed. Those consequences no longer appeared traceable to discrete decisions made by identifiable individuals. They seemed instead like the inevitable outcome of vast historical forces, or the collective responsibility of an entire nation, or the unique pathology of a single dictatorial figure. The system that had actually enabled the harm, the administrative and bureaucratic infrastructure that had translated ideology into implemented policy, became less visible in retrospective analysis than the dramatic images of collapse and punishment. By the conclusion of this examination, Benito Mussolini can no longer be adequately understood through the caricature preserved in archival footage and popular memory. The theatrical gestures, the elaborate uniforms, the balcony speeches broadcast to assembled crowds. These elements were never the substantive story. They constituted the visible surface, the performative dimension that attracted attention and shaped memory. What endures with greater consequence is the quieter achievement, a demonstrated method for exercising authoritarian control that taught harm to move through bureaucratic forms, legal regulations, and economic incentives, rather than relying primarily on direct violence. A governmental system that made participation feel ordinary and necessary, while making resistance feel impractical and dangerous. This explains why Mussolini's legacy cannot be comfortably contained within the historical period of Italian fascism. The enduring significance lies not in the specific iconography of black shirts and Roman salutes, but in the lessons learned about how authoritarianism can wear the appearance of legitimacy and procedural correctness. The Italian fascist experience demonstrated that large-scale destruction and systematic exclusion do not always require social chaos or visible brutality to succeed. Sometimes they arrive organized, documented, processed through established institutions, and applauded as national progress and necessary modernization. Long before populations fully recognized what fundamental rights and protections were being eliminated, those rights had already been processed out of existence through procedures that appeared legal, and reforms that claimed to serve the public good. Historical education frequently trains us to recognize authoritarianism through its most dramatic manifestations: the consolidation of power through coups, the spectacle of mass rallies, the obvious brutality of secret police and concentration camps. Mussolini's Italy offers a different and equally important lesson. Power does not always need to announce itself through spectacular rupture to fundamentally reshape human lives and eliminate freedom. It can achieve the same ends through normalization, through the patient reorganization of institutions and expectations, through the establishment of systems in which harm becomes administratively routine. This is the element worth preserving in historical memory, not the theatrical performances or the eventual military collapse, but the method itself. Because methods are portable. They outlive the specific individuals who develop and refine them. They can be studied, adapted, and re-implemented in different contexts and different eras. And they function most effectively when populations mistake procedural order for genuine safety. When people conflate administrative regularity with political neutrality. When the machinery of control has become so embedded in daily life that it no longer registers as control at all.